Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Josh Wright is the executive director at Ideas 42. In addition to the responsibility for the organization overall, Josh focuses on designing and implementing behavioral solutions to problems in financial services, poverty, healthcare, and education. Josh has extensive experience in the for-profit, nonprofit, and public sectors, industry experience in financial services, media and entertainment, housing and youth development, and functional expertise in business strategy, new business development, and new venture creation. Prior to joining Ideas 42, Josh headed up the Office of Financial Education and Financial Access at the United States Department of the Treasury. And previously, Josh held positions at the Center for Community Change, Booz Allen and Hamilton's commercial management consulting business. And he was also a senior executive at the Bertelsmann's Random House. He holds a BA in economics from Wesleyan University and an MBA from the Yale School of Management. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here with you.
So I figure as an opening, I often will give my guests a bit of a tough first question, which makes me a bit of a jerk host. But I figure for us, I'll start with a lob and then I'll go in with a fastball, if you're okay with that.
Sounds great.
Okay. So I heard you talk, or I think I watched a talk. I can't remember where or what it was exactly, but feel free to fact check this, where you mentioned something that to me is actually only after the fact so patently obvious and true, but that I'd actually never given it so much thought before. You know, that's sort of a theme in behavioral insights generally. But what it is that we go into grocery stores and grocery retail stores and we see that food purchases for ketchup sales are far larger than those for mustard sales. What's your behavioral based hypothesis of why you think that's the case?
I think it's really two things. One is that at the end of the day, there is much less choice around ketchup. And we know this from behavioral science about humans, is that we like choice. We're attracted to it. So we're attracted to retirement plans that have more choice. We go into stores where there's lots of choice. But when confronted with lots of choice, we often have trouble choosing exactly what we want. And if you go into your standard supermarket aisle and you look at ketchups, there's basically just ketchup. There's not lots of variations of ketchup. But if you look at the mustard aisle, there's Dijon and honey mustard and Frenchie's Original, and there's typically 20 choices of mustards to choose from. So I think that is a big driver of it. There's also a great New Yorker article about the science of ketchup and how ketchup actually, the way it's constructed with its amount of sweet, sugar, and salt, really connects for us in all of our taste buds and the neuroreceptors connected to those taste buds. So it's been optimized in that way, that there's this one that people love, but it's compound or added to and additionally effective because there's just basically one choice. Yes, you have to choose between Heinz and the store-bought brand, for example, but they're all basically the same.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's, I often wonder that the store, ketchup is ketchup, as you said, and like I wonder if there's been blind taste tests to be able to distinguish between the so-called premium of Heinz versus your more budget-friendly ketchup. I just, there's not much in it. I doubt people would be able to discern between the two.
I'm sure there's a PhD student somewhere who's done that blind taste test.
His or her PhD dissertation.
Exactly.
I don't doubt it. Yeah, God love them, those academics. So that's interesting, and I know it's a funny and little trivial example, but it really does tap into some of the curiosities of human behavior and human decision making. So a couple things, and then we'll move on to the more harder fastball pitch. I don't know if this is true. This might be me because I have my bias that I much prefer mustard. I love mustard over ketchup. And do you think that ketchup is more of a amateur, younger kids prefer ketchup over mustard, and that once your taste buds mature and your sense of taste develops, that mustard is sort of a more nuanced and subtle flavor that we can appreciate and savor. So I wonder if it's an age thing at some point.
Maybe, although I think we might want to investigate things like I haven't done lots of research or seen lots of research on this, but the behavioral scientist in me would say like, well, maybe we want to investigate identity a little bit, because you do have this thought about ketchup as like the thing young kids eat with French fries.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where you fall on the foodie spectrum, but maybe you really like food and think of yourself as a food connoisseur, and therefore to confirm and be consistent with your identity, you think and tell yourself, not consciously but subconsciously, that you're supposed to like the more subtle mustard. And you probably, if I asked you the type of mustard you like, you probably would say like, well, not Frenchies. Right. You probably
I'm
choose
above
like
that.
the Grey Poupon crushed Dijon mustard or something like that.
Yeah, at a $10 price point. That's
Exactly.
interesting, and I've actually thought about this quite a bit. And here we are dwelling on food, which is interesting. But I thought about that this notion of identity and even demographics and status within society. So you think about things that have a more nuanced or even a more extreme flavor. So espresso versus your bland coffees that are like double, what we call in Canada double, which is just basically cream and sugar and coffee. Then you think of your watered down Coors Light, Bud Light, dare I say, American beer, compared to your stronger, higher alcohol by volume content microbreweries.
Yeah.
And you do see that these differences in a product category map onto some pretty clear demographic and personality and identity variables. And, it's not, there's the objective taste and quality aspect, but then there's all sorts of other things that come with it, like you said, like identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be, again, it'd be interesting to try and unpackage this about how much, it's not that humans don't have individual tastes, right, or individual attributes to them that distinguish them, but we're generally more alike than we're different. So it'd really be interesting to try and figure out unpackaging what percentage of it is driven by psychology and things like identity or other contextual features, social norms of, your friend, you go out to bars with your friends and they're also drinking microbrews, and then you feel like you should drink those microbrews also, versus the person who's drinking Bud Light because their friends are drinking Bud Light, versus what are actual people's ground truth taste interests or taste preferences. I think probably very hard to study because they're so intertwined, and how do you get to the real ground truth there?
You'd have to do some sort of like causal experimentation where you create a new product and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, you see why then marketers, definitely try to think about those identities and what they pitch around their products, and how the construct of what they're setting up for people who are drinking Bud Light versus people who might be drinking Sam Adams. And what the ad is trying to connect with for people. I mean, marketers, I think, while they may not always know all the deep studies around behavioral science, through trial and error, know a lot of the behavioral sciences anyway.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. And even a few weeks ago, I came across, it was either Glenlivet or Glenfiddich, which has a clear brand identity of the type of consumer who who drinks Scotch, that type of single malt Scotch. And they actually released a new product line that is these little tablets almost that you bite. And so you pop the tablet and you get this essentially a shot of single malt Scotch, and you go, continue on with you. And it was responded to and reacted with such moral outrage from the Scotch drinking community, because it's completely counter to what you're supposed to do: sit by a fire smoking a cigar and a nice single malt. Now it's like, oh, I gotta go, so I'm just gonna pop this little pod. So you know what? I think we just validated that PhD student to do this dissertation. At first we laughed, but man, there's a serious psychology behind this, I think.
Yeah, hopefully a student will be listening to this and get excited about it and launch into that research.
Yeah, and give us due credit in their in their thesis when they go to write it, right?
Right.
So let's pivot a bit. I if you'd humor me for a second, so I'm in Ontario in Canada. We are actually I'll get to that in a second, but I moved recently, changed addresses, and so I had to get a new license. So finally my new license came in the mail. And here in Ontario and in most provinces in Canada, we get the option to opt in for organ donations anytime we renew either a license or a health card, I believe. So I got the letter in addition to my new license for the option to fill out to become an organ donor. So of course we know that organ donation as the favorite of low hanging fruits for the behavioral scientists and behavioral insights people, getting at defaults and presumed consent and so on. I was really curious. I was like, oh, I wonder what subtle nudge in language they're going to be using these days, because we do have a dedicated team, behavioral insights team in the province of Ontario. And I was so happy to see it. And this is what it said at the part of where I could sort of choose to flip over. It said, quote, "Be nice even after you die." And then below that, this is the best part. It started off the sentence with, "Canadians are nice and generous, ... And then continued on with the actual appeal to fill out the information. And it was interesting because I think their first, so I love that because there's a stereotype that Canadians are just a bunch of nice people. And so it's like, I feel like they have to dub a new social norm, come up with some sort of, I don't know, like the nice guy, nice gal Canadian social norm or something like that. But they've added, because a couple years ago they came out and they published these findings where they had your simple social norm manipulation, and then they had just simplified no language, no copy. And what they found was that the no copy, the simplified version with no language at all, was the most effective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it led to something like 2.5 times more people signing up, opting in. So I'm curious, just to what are your hunches, what are your intuitions, your hypotheses about this next step they're taking with be nice even after you die, and Canadians are nice and generous?
Well, I really think that there's two things I think we can take away from this. One is that we have to test. So they come up with this idea, and it's so, in behavioral science, it's so context specific, right? And so they're trying to, I think, play on some identity about Canadians being nice, and doing this step. But there's also some research around death. There's actually this great podcast, The Hidden Brain, which I'm sure you know well.
Mm-hmm.
And Shankar interviewed this psychologist named Sheldon Solomon recently, and he looks at and really studies people's relationship to death, and all the things that our fear of death actually causes us to do, and the ways that it causes us to behave. And I'm not sure. My hypothesis would be that this might not work too well, because people hear death and that puts them into a certain negative place, whether you're saying be nice or not. There's a bunch of research about this, about what that causes people to do, which kind of like hunkers down into their cultural norms. So maybe their cultural norm is not to do things like organ donation, or maybe it feels a little bit weird to them. So I think there's two things to take away from this. Like, one is that it's very important to know the psychology and try and do diagnosis deeply. But then the second thing is that you won't really know because it's so context specific. So you really need to test. So hopefully they would be able to test these variations in letters or variations in framing, to see which was more effective. Because you're right, sometimes the simple language might actually be more effective. And it's not just testing one time. You have to test it at the time, but then you should go back after it's running for a while and potentially retest, continue to innovate, and make sure that the idea that you had continues to win or continues to work.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And your hunch is interesting, and I think I also resonate with that. I'm one of the weird people where I don't mind death or talking about death. One of my favorite books is Christopher Hitchens, I think it's called Mortality, which he basically wrote on his deathbed.
Uh-huh.
And the last few pages are just absolute nonsense because he's literally physically dying, which is fascinating psychologically. But anyways, I actually try and share that book with, friends and colleagues, and the response and the reaction I get from people is it's a taboo, even in Western society and Canadian society to talk about death. So I think you're right about that, and I'd be curious how the data will bear out to confirm or disconfirm what they're clearly trying to test out. But that copy, that line, what is it? Is be nice even after you die.
Right.
That sounds a bit heavy for people.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to see what actually comes from that. The Canadians are nice and generous is an interesting one. It's tapping into that social norm and that identity of nice people, nice Canadians. So yeah, I think they're obviously trying to see if they can get a bit of an uptick from the original increase, which was definitely a success. But I'd like to get your opinion on, given the fact that the most effective ones so far, and I don't know if there's actual statistical differences between the different interventions, but the highest numerical increase was the one, as I said, that didn't have any language at all. It was just a blank space of what they called the simplistic intervention. Do you think there needs to be more of that? And if that's the case, is that in some contexts, in some cases, is that all it takes for us to do our work, is to just make it super simple and remove the language, remove the complexity?
I don't think that's all it takes. And again, we should diagnose, but I do think, and there's a lot of research in behavioral science that shows small hassles, what we at Ideas 42 call hassle factors, have these outside effects on what people do, even when the benefits of doing the thing are significantly high, or not doing it are negative. So I do think it's almost universal that if you can make things just simpler and easier for people, it's going to be beneficial. Now, language, like, clearly having something short and not 5 paragraphs is better, whether the language is very simple and that alone, or it tries to play on social norms or loss aversion, or in this case, they're trying to, be generous after you die. Again, I think those things need to be tested. So it's not all about simplicity, but if all else being equal, you should try and make things easier and simple for people, because those small hassles do get in the way of people completing important things. And in this case, I think it's interesting. The most effective thing would be just to switch the default, right? So making people opt out of the organ donation versus opt in, as you know, shows massively more effective in getting people to do organ donation. I think when you compare countries like Germany versus Austria, there's 60 to 70 point percentage difference in organ donation. It's just based on one being you have to opt out of it versus opting into it.
Yeah, and I think here in Canada, it's province by province. So East Coast province of Nova Scotia is, I believe it's in sort of being passed in legislation right now, that they're going to an opt-out system, and it's been met with a lot of reaction and criticism. But it's one of those, again, as I said, those low-hanging fruits.
Yeah.
And just why not, I suppose, and
Yeah.
be the differences in those percentages, like you said.
Yeah.
Is in the U.S. Is it state by state, or is it a federal thing? Do you know?
I'm pretty sure it's state by state, because most of those things happen related to driver's licenses, and the driver's licenses are a state-based ID and process. Each state has different processes of when you can get your driver's license, what you have to go through. I know this because I now have a 15 and a half year old daughter who's just in the process now of getting her learner's permit and going to driver's ed. And we live in Maryland, and we're 2 blocks from DC, and DC has slightly different rules, and Virginia has different rules. So it is by state.
Interesting. So you mentioned there that very just sort of offhand the diagnose part. Well, we have to diagnose, and we have to learn about what's actually happening before we design or test. Um, I often, because I straddle the worlds of industry or practice and still academia, because that's where I received my formal training, I spend a lot of my time, too much of my time, thinking about the differences between the behavioral scientists on either side of that fence. And it seems that the whole diagnose part for the academic type behavioral scientist is largely missing. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But how in your work that you do with Ideas 42, how does diagnose actually play a role? And how does that distinguish itself from the type of work that's being done in more basic research in academia?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say about diagnose. I think, one important thing to realize and just how to think about it is that, excuse me, you would never go back to a doctor if you walked into the doctor's office. They looked at you, didn't do any tests, didn't ask you any questions, and they just said, yes, it's clear you require chemotherapy, or you require antibiotics, or you require X heart medication. That would be crazy, right? And I think it's the same thing with behavioral science. These problems are complex. There's humans involved, and there's actually things we can look at, diagnosis we can do about the context and the situation, and looking at hard data when it's available and qualitative data when quantitative data is not available, to suss out what's going on. Why is it possible? And again, it's like medicine. We like to think that medicine, you go in and the doctor knows exactly, oh, you have this condition. But medicine has this art and science aspect to it as well, where there's a lot of judgment involved in what are the tests saying, and what are the different components of the diagnosis that the doctor is trying to interpret. And it's the same thing, I think, in behavioral science. So that's the first thing. I think a good mental model is to think about this as, how do doctors go about solving problems, right? They diagnose what's going on and trying to look at facts and data. So that's the first thing I would say. And then I would say, I think it depends, related to the academic, about whether they do diagnosis or not. Sometimes academics are researching a particular field, say it's identity. So if you go and talk to them about some problem that a business or a government or a nonprofit is having, and you say, like, well, what do you think we should try out? Surprise, surprise, lo and behold, they say, oh, we should test something related to identity. I think it's identity related. Other academics, often ones that are further along in their career, are more open to other ideas. Now, they don't use the same process always that we use, but I do think that they're thinking quite a bit about what's going on. And they have because they know psychology so well, they have a good intuition of what's going on. And so they are varying what they might try out and test. And the way we do diagnosis is just, first agreeing on what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and then coming up with hypotheses about what we think are going on. Like, what we call behavioral bottlenecks? Why would someone not be signing up for organ donation? And it might be that they're making a totally what we would consider a cold state, like fully thinking about the choice, and that is truly consistently the choice they would want all the time. But there could be other things at play, right? And so it's really about digging into what are the behavioral bottlenecks that might be in the way of someone making a decision where they would consistently make the decision, and they're doing it in a cold state, or as Daniel Kahneman would say, using their system 2, part of their brain. And you make those hypotheses, and then you go and look for, again, data that's either qualitative or quantitative that help you confirm or disconfirm those hypotheses.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like that. Why I like it is I think I see you could have a seasoned academic researcher who in their wealth of knowledge and expertise just has all of that information in the back of their mind constantly. So it could be that they're quote unquote diagnosing the problem or the question or the hypothesis almost in an unconscious way, so that when it comes time to put pen to paper and test a hypothesis, they've ruled out competing or alternative hypotheses, and they know the literatures so well that they can sort of cross them out and arrive at what is a more reasonable one to actually test
Yeah.
and run that study. So that makes sense. Just to focus a little bit on Ideas 42 a bit, you guys are a giant in the, as a lot of the listeners know, in the field. You have an impressive list of projects and engagements and a series of compiled insights, and it's quite wonderful. Of all of those in the past decade or so, which one would you say remains your favorite, if you have one, or if there's a couple or a handful, and why?
Yeah, I have a couple. And I think I would like to touch on sort of slightly different examples, because I would like to kind of go on the spectrum of what I would consider tweaks to more significant changes. So why don't we start with the tweaks? One of my favorite is the work that we did in New York City around redesigning their summons. And so what do I mean when I say summons? In New York City, like many cities in the US, if you commit some minor infraction, an open container of alcohol in public, littering, you actually get something that looks like a ticket. And most people actually think it's a ticket. It's actually a summons to appear in court or a fine to pay. So what can you do? You can either pay the fine and you don't have to appear in court. It's fine, no problem. Or you can go to court. The thing is, if you don't pay the fine and you don't go to court, a warrant gets issued for your arrest. And so you're probably thinking like, well, that can't happen that often, Josh, right? Well, in New York City, they're writing 350 to 400,000 summons a year. And actually about 35 to 40% of those summons result in arrest warrants. And then people get stopped on the street for some other minor offense, or they get a traffic stop. The police officer at that point then has no choice but to arrest the person and take them to jail. And that causes disruption in family. People lose their jobs because they end up spending a night in jail. They don't show up for work. And not surprisingly, that it's more likely people of fewer means that end up in those situations, right? Because if I got the ticket, I would just pay the ticket. But if you don't have the resources and you feel like it's maybe a parking ticket, or you think about it like a parking ticket, you ignore it, you forget about it. There's other things that you have that are higher priority. So what did we do? We simply redesigned the summons as one step, right? So that the summons doesn't look like a parking ticket, and it's very clear up front what the implications are and what you need to do. These two choices. And you can go on the Ideas 42 website for listeners and look at the actual old summons and new summons. But then the other thing is we allowed people to give their telephone number, their cell phone number, to the police officer, so that they could get reminders about the court date if they needed to appear. And then they receive behaviorally informed text messages, and we texted out different reminders. And doing those two simple things, which cost pennies per person, you have a massive reduction in the number of people that end up with arrest warrants, like a 40 percentage point reduction for so little. So you end up having tens of thousands of fewer people in New York actually ending up with arrest warrants. And now we're trying to figure out how do you scale that and get other cities to adopt it. So that's like absolutely one of my favorite. Then I think if you go to the next level of intensity, and that one, I think when I say all of that to you, it's not, you say, no, duh, why aren't we doing that all the time, right? Like make it clear what the thing is someone's getting and send them reminders. And there are a bunch of things, I think, in behavioral science where people say no, duh, after the fact. And then, our response is, well, why wasn't it being done before? And I think a big chunk of that is because it's underappreciated how much those little changes can matter. But if you go to something that I think is even more subtle, you take family planning in the developing world, right? So if you ask a woman in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, if they've had a child, would they like to not have another child in the next 2 to 3 years? Over 70% say yes. So there's this intention women don't. but then they don't use family planning, right? They don't use contraception and birth control. And for a long time it was thought, well, maybe they're saying they don't want to have a kid, but then they really do, or there's access problems, there's not clinics. There's actually been a lot of money spent by great organizations like the Gates Foundation and governments on increasing the number of clinics. So access is much less of a problem now. But yet still women are not using it at a high rate. And so then when you start to dig in and diagnose, you realize that there are two decision makers in this decision. There are endeavors and interventions we've created focused on women, but there's been very little focused on how are men influencing and engaging in the decision around family planning. And there's some evidence that they actually don't encourage the use of family planning. But then when you get into it and you present to men the benefits and negative aspects of having another kid and whether they want their wife to use family planning, the numbers go way up. And so we actually created a game which is being tested out in Uganda, which men play. It's like a simple card game where just men are playing. They're put in teams and they go through this practice, this game, which really highlights a couple of things. One is it highlights the risks and benefits and costs associated with having additional kids and how that plays out. It dispels myths, like myths that a woman can't get pregnant if she's breastfeeding. And then also it normalizes for men this idea of talking about and being engaged in the family planning process. So we'll see how it goes. We're very much about having evidence, so it's being tested out in Uganda now, but we're pretty optimistic that using a game structure for men to learn and understand the risks in a different way, and then be engaged in the conversation will likely be quite helpful and successful in the decision that women are ultimately making, but men influence in these family planning decisions.
Do you have any other treatment conditions, or is it just the as is and this one that the card game you mentioned?
The other, there's as is, and then there's the control treatment, which is basically what's done now, which is to try and give people traditional education or pamphlets and information about family planning.
And what is it about the game? Is it the game part, or is it? We sort of mentioned this, but I'm just curious again if you don't mind reiterating. Is it the game part that you think is going to go above and beyond the control of pamphlets and information, or is it the sharing with others?
I think it's two. I think it's two things. I think it's the game part. We've done other experiments where having people go through simple games where they answer questions about risks. And then get the correct answer and continue to play the game and go back and forth with these different types of questions actually then shows that they're much more likely to understand risk not only after playing the game, but months later, 3 months later. So I think some of it is like the engagement aspect of the game and how people learn through the game. But then the second part is the social aspect that the men are playing the game and talking about these issues. And realizing that these are issues that other men are struggling with and thinking through and normalizing that from a norms perspective. I think those are the two kind of behavioral, what we call insights that we think are going to make this more powerful.
That's really, really fascinating and such, noble and important work that you guys are known to do. And it's so important for various reasons. But it's also tricky because in this particular case, that's a long time. That's a long timeline to you have to measure your before and after, and logistically it's quite complex, and you have to wait a certain amount of time, obviously, to get your outcome variables of did they have a child or not. What sort of timeline are you guys working with this project?
Well, one of the key things we'll be able to see, which is pretty quickly, is whether people actually use the family planning methods. Like what, do they engage with the clinic? What family planning methods do they actually end up choosing? So, and then, we often talk about these proximate measures. What measures can we have that are not too far off in the future that are likely to be very predictive of the ultimate thing we care about is like, does the person actually not have the kid? And if you see them using the contraceptive measures, the statistics around whether the contraceptive measures are successful are pretty high, particularly with long-acting contraception. So that's one of the things also that the game does is, and there's again our good friend with choice overload, and one of the challenges with contraception and family planning is there's lots of different choices, right? You can use condoms, there's birth control pills, there's implants, there's IUDs. So, and one of the things you can see is, do they choose to use longer acting contraceptive methods where you don't have to make this habitual choice every time, like you might have to with a condom.
In the heat of the moment,
yeah.
as they say. Very, very cool. Well, I will, and listeners, I'm sure, will keep our eyes peeled for that. Do you have a projected date of when the data will come in?
I think we should know in the spring. We should have results in around the spring timeframe.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. And that's what I love about the work in similar organizations as yours, is that a lot of what you do is publicly available, is open access, versus the more for-profit sector, which is oftentimes kept close to the chest of those scientists and designers, because I think the more we know about our science, about our applied science, the more nuance, the better, and the more robust we will become as a field overall. So I think I really like how you guys make it available on your site, in such a way, like any good science would, to share that wealth of knowledge.
And if I can plug one thing that we've created with others, is something called the Behavioral Evidence Hub. So yes, we have our website. You can go and read about our projects. But one of the things that we've seen and feel like is a little bit lacking is, where's one place that a practitioner, not necessarily an academics can search journals and papers and find these studies that have been done, and then they can digest them because they're used to reading academic writing. And the Behavioral Evidence Hub is taken our work, but taken other work of other organizations and work of very applied academics. And we now have a few more than 100 interventions. And what we do is we really talk about it from the perspective of the practitioner, right? Because if you're the practitioner and you're interested in social norms, you want to be able to see, like, oh, where did it work? And what was the actual intervention, right? So instead of, often when you read academic paper, it's a little bit hard to tell what was the exact language that was used in a particular intervention, if the letter was changed or something like that. You can drill down and read the statistical charts if you want to, and it'll point you to the original study. But it's really making it in a digestible way for practitioners to be able to say, well, is this context similar to the context I might be working in? And what was actually done? What was tried out? Can I actually see the real comparison of the summons, or the comparison of the difference in the letter that was used, or the technology, the screenshots of the text that were sent? So I really encourage people to go to check out the Behavioral Evidence Hub if they want that kind of very practical practitioner's perspective on how to apply some of these things.
And I will link to that in the notes, so people can easily access that. And I'd imagine in a short time from now, a few years down the road, that we have such a body of evidence and so many case examples of various interventions in different contexts, that we might even be able to apply like a machine learning type algorithm to automate the process to some extent, where, and this is like big picture, blue sky thinking, where a practitioner goes in and says, they're dealing with X and Y problem in this particular context and situation with this client or this person or set of people, and they enter in a different fields, and the algorithm does its magical computations, and at the other end spits out what will maybe like a likelihood estimate or a probability estimate of this particular intervention could work, or that one. Do you see our field getting to that point of more of a merging of behavioral science and data science?
Yeah, so it's really interesting you should say that. I have a couple of things to share about that. One is Ideas 42 is doing an increasing amount of work in machine learning. One of our great founders, Sendhil Mullainathan, Ideas 42 is founded by Sendhil Mullainathan, who was at Harvard at the time, Eldar Shafir, a psychologist from Princeton, and Antoinette Shore, an economist at MIT, among others. Sendhil now is spending almost all of his time on machine learning, very little time on traditional behavioral science. And so where a subset of our work now is focused on machine learning in a couple areas. One is the machine learning has great capability and potential to help us tease out heterogeneous treatment effects and really understand what interventions are working for which parts of the population in a way that's more effective and more powerful than the traditional way we've done it, which is to sort of say, okay, I'm going to do subgroup and still use regression and do subgroup analysis. So that's one way. The second is just as humans are really great at some decisions and not so great at other decisions, and often the decisions they're not so great at are when they're quite data heavy, and so creating new prediction tools that humans can use. And then the third area, which I think goes a little bit to what you were talking about specifically, also is there's going to be all these great algorithms created, and I think a place that's underinvested in and under considered is, okay, that's great, but how are we going to get the humans to listen to the algorithms? How are we going to get the humans to interact with the machines? Because sometimes it's that the humans need to listen, but sometimes it's that the human need to actually override the machine. And there's a bunch of research in machine learning that shows that it's not man versus machine or human versus machine. It's actually, how do you add those two together? And when do you follow the machine and when do you ask the human? And so I think there's actually a bunch of research that can be done around the behavioral science of how humans interact with algorithms. And I think that there'll be kind of phenotypes of contexts. One that we're already been investigated a couple of times is, how do experts listen to algorithms? So how do doctors listen to algorithms about everything from heart attack diagnosis to x-rays? And how do judges listen to algorithms about who they should detain before trial versus let out? And so that's like one I just use as an example of a phenotype of how do you get the expert to listen to the algorithm. And so I think you can then do a bunch of research, try out different things, and then eventually be able to do some combination of machine learning, but also meta-analysis. I think meta-analysis has been underutilized in behavioral science so far. One of my favorite psychologists, John Lynch from Colorado, has done great meta-analysis around the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness around financial education programs, for example. And John's a big proponent of us as a field using meta-analysis more effectively, particularly as we get more and more studies that are field-based. They're trying out social norms, for example, in lots of different contexts. Then being able to do meta-analysis and say, like, well, how effective are they, and what are the variations in the context that make it more effective? So you can get to a better sense of where are things generalizable. That's the big holy grail. Everyone wants to know, like, well, how generalizable is this insight? And I think in behavioral science, the message so far has been you have to be careful that it's because context matters so much. It's not often ubiquitously generalizable. But I think as we get more and more, we can then start to use machine learning and meta-analysis to get a sense of where it's generalizable and where it's not. Sorry to get too much into the nerdy aspects of meta-analysis and machine learning.
I love meta-analysis. Yeah. They're definitely useful. And even in academia, that's sort of anytime you're trying to figure something out or familiarize yourself with a particular literature, a meta-analysis is your first step to go, because it's just such a time saver, as opposed to you sifting through the individual studies. Just go to the aggregate effect size and have your starting point there. So I think an analogous case where we have something like that in practice for practitioners would be highly valuable, especially when time and resources is the consideration of time and resources is much more important than in academia, where you can just sit around and navel gaze for a career. Joking, academics. I'm going to lose my academic audience if I keep. And I'm one of them, sort of.
Well, we like to poke fun at academics, but the reality is, if the academics weren't doing the deeper thinking and coming up with the foundational research, we wouldn't have the 30 years of behavioral science to build on, and be able to create great organizations like Ideas 42 to have positive social impact. We really
that's right. Yeah, and I concur that with it's and yet at the same time I struggle and they struggle because they're not so out of the throes of a replication or replicability crisis, And something that I often think about and talk to colleagues and clients is a lot of the field of not behavioral science, but let's say social psychology and to some extent cognitive and personality psychology is on shaky ground because of the lack of replication of some of the most what we thought were tried and true effects. And so if we in industry and practice are leaning on that science, which isn't as strong as we initially thought it was, what does that mean for the type of work that we're doing? What does that mean for the interventions that we borrow, and the theories that we draw on from academia? I don't know if that's something that you've seen come out in practice, and maybe it's just something that's not a concern. Maybe field experiments and field interventions are just sort of different entirely.
No, I think it's a concern and something to be aware of as you do that diagnosis, and then you move to design. Also, you have to know the literature of what's been tried and that foundational research. And we're always cautious when there's one study about something and it feels sort of obscure or maybe a significant subset of some other psychological concept. We would say like, oh, we have to be cautious about how much we would really tout that as a solution we're going to push or bake in without doing further testing. I think some of the replication crisis is overblown because I also think that so much of our work is based on foundational parts of psychology that are very, very well documented, right? That humans have limited cognition, that we have this amazing 3-pound computer between our ears that can do amazing things like language recognition and be able to speak at ways that are much more powerful than computers by the time you're age 6. But there's also great stuff that we know about limited cognition, about limited attention, and that is what drives a lot of the use of heuristics, and how people then make quick decisions. And so I think it's a little bit overblown. I think when you get to these more obscure things or things that are subtle, like identity is a very subtle, there's a lot of things around psychology of identity, and it can be very subtle. And so, and there's been lots of studies like identity is definitely impacting people's decisions. But then when you go to design something, you have to think, I think, very hard about how you design it in a way that doesn't have backfire effects, and be cautious about that versus perspective memory, the fact that people forget about things they're supposed to do in the future. I don't think there's any concern from the replication crisis that perspective memory exists, and therefore like timely reminders to help people are going to be powerful.
Yeah, you're right. I think the fundamental, probably cognitive psychology, the things related to memory and attention and perception, those are robust. Those are very reliable. And I think a lot of the behavioral insights work draws and relies on that side of the research. Yep. It's more in the field that where I was trained in social psychology, and where I see that maybe being more of a concern is in the space of behavioral insights for marketing and consumer psychology. And that's actually one space where there hasn't been a whole lot compared to, like, say, policy or even product development. So, and I wonder if that's the case, it's because they are probably drawing on a set of the research that is related to the social psychology and having to navigate their way through a set of effects that can't be replicated or might not be able to be replicated. So I wonder if that's the case. But I see that as we advance as a field of practice, that the low hanging fruit is being taken care of, and I don't mean to dismiss that type of work. It's really important, and it will continue to be important. But I think we'll get to a point where we sort of have a good grasp on that stuff, the stuff that's a little bit easier to tackle, and then we'll get to a point where, like, maybe in 5 or 10 plus years, where we're delving into a little bit more of the subtleties and the nuance of human psychology and behavior. And that's where I think where we might be a little bit more concerned of what theories and what insights we're drawing on, because that's where it's going to get even more
Yeah,
complex.
and that's why testing
For
continues
us.
to be important. But I think even something like social psychology, I don't think there's any doubt in the literature and thinking that we as humans are cooperative social beings. That's one of the reasons why we've been able to outcompete any other species on the planet, and that we're influenced pretty deeply by what we see others around us doing that we view as like us. Right? Like, I don't think there's any doubt that that's true. There's a lot of subtlety in, well, what does like us mean? How is the brain thinking about those sort of things and then reacting to them? So I think, when we design things around social norms, we look at the literature and the subtlety a lot more heavily, and then we're even more concerned about testing. But I still think that even in social psychology, there's a lot there that's pretty. It's not like you're walking around on quicksand. It's pretty firm ground to be walking around on. When you get into more subtle things, and I think like I don't want to get too much into the pointing fingers, but if you look at like the power posing situation with Amy Cuddy, like there wasn't a lot else out there that suggested that that was valid, right? And so if you were going to rely on trying to create an intervention around that, you might want to be cautious, because there just wasn't as much other supporting evidence in the literature that would suggest it was the effect was as big as it was thought to be.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time, and I have one final question for you, but just as a primer, a bit of a cliffhanger for listeners, and this means I'm going to have you on again in future. And I know we very briefly spoke about this, but I think the next big problem for us to try and solve is the gap between individual behavior and the characteristics of the collective of groups. And that has a lot of implications for, like workplaces and organizations and employees. And something that I've been thinking about quite a lot in terms of workplace and organizational culture. And there's this quote, Thomas Hobbes, I think, said it. I have it here in front of me, that he said, "How does the behavior of individuals create the characteristics of groups?" And that is a fundamental premise of all of the social sciences. And after centuries of us asking that question, I still don't think we have a firm handle on that. So in my mind, I think the behavioral insights practitioners and the behavioral scientists, that's the next big focus, or at least one of the next big focuses. And so related to that, my final question for you, just being mindful of your time, is what I call the BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. Ask all my guests. And so I'll ask you, Josh, is what do you see as there's a lot of problems in society, a lot of issues that we're facing as humans. Where do you see behavioral insights playing a big part in finding a solution to some of those problems?
Yeah, I mean, I have a number, but I'll choose climate change. But I think there's a subtle difference about where I think the big opportunity is, which is behavioral science has been used a lot related to climate change, but how do you get individuals to change their behavior as the end consumer, right? So adopting electric cars, we're actually doing a project right now around that. Or the great company O-Power that was invented or created that gets people to consume less energy. And that's all great. But I think actually for us to address climate change, there's going to be some bigger structural and policy issues that need to get addressed. And I see the opportunity for behavioral science is, how do you get humans to vote differently related to climate change about who it is that they choose as their candidates in a nonpartisan way, not individual candidates, but what can behavioral science help us do around getting people to increase the seriousness in which they view climate change, right? So there's great research now that shows more than 70% of Americans think that climate change is real. They think it's caused by human activity. But still around 50% of people think that it's going to be, only 50% of people think that it's going to be a big issue in their lifetime. And then if you ask people when they're voting, do they think climate change is important? They say yes. But then if you ask them to force rank it, it's not in their top three. And there's a bunch of research that shows that people vote based on their kind of top three priorities. And often those things are economy and social issues. So how can behavioral science be used to raise that up into the top three so that people actually vote differently and choose different elected officials that care more about and are going to enact policies around climate change? Because in no way are we going to solve climate change if it's just about getting people to decide to consume slightly less electricity or buy electric cars. There's going to need to be structural and policy changes around things like carbon taxes and subsidies for different types of energy generation. So that I'm very excited about that. That's an area where we're starting to investigate and try and partner with academics around to do some of that research and then figure out how do you create interventions that can be used to get those candidates elected.
That's great. Well, sounds like as usual, lots of exciting things coming out of Ideas 42. And it's a place I always look to, and it's a place that I know a lot of people look to learn about, behavioral science, and to learn about behavior change for good. And so I think I join listeners in applauding you and your efforts and the team. And you guys are such a fast growing team, it looks like. And I didn't get a chance to talk about the actual structure and the talent of your team at Ideas 42. But as I said, it'd be great to have you back on again in future. So thanks so much, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.